Ileana sat underneath a tree just as a messenger pigeon arrived. 3 months had passed, and she'd gotten a report that told of Magnus' escape. She smiled, glad it's finally happened. In the original story, after Magnus flees, he was saved and cared for by a doctor who works in the medical center. That is how he meets the female lead. Afterwards she will assume the role of Empress. There is roughly a year before the storyline starts, so their meeting a little earlier shouldn't cause any distortions in the original plot. She felt relief that everything was happening according to her plan, but then gasped as she was doused in icy water. What just happened? She realized as soon as a voice spoke up, an insincere apology on their lips. It was Simeon, a fellow priest in training who'd seemed to have developed a dislike for Ileana. Ileana told her that although she might be drenched, she still looked radiant. Simeon grew angry and insulted Ileana, calling her stupid, but all Ileana did was inform her that in her process of bullying Ileana, she'd wet a book borrowed from the temple. Simeon's eyes widened in alarm at her words but continued to berate Ileana. She didn't really want to be a priest, Simeon had guessed. Why would a noble born with everything in their hands want to be a priest? It didn't make sense. What were her ulterior motives in coming here? She questioned Ileana. She'd felt insulted that Ileana would be there pretending to have faith in God. Ileana told her that she wouldn't deny her claims, but she also wouldn't be committing any atrocious acts like stealing anyone's position here. She turned and looked at her with a calm expression. As devoted as you are, you can't justify bullying just because of your faith. With that she left Simeon, who had the grace to look ashamed. Trivial acts like this were of little significance to her. She had much more concerning matters to worry about. They hadn't shown themselves since that day, but why did she feel so restless? He watched from the treetops as the two princes ran with only a personal knight to protect them. And it seemed they were running from a hunter. Third Prince Magnus, who'd returned a year ago, came into view. He watched entirely entertained. Who would make it out alive and ascend to the throne? They ran as if being chased by an army. They stopped at the edge of the cliff, nowhere left to go. He appeared, walking leisurely into the clearing. He smiled, that same dangerous glint in his eyes. He taunted his brothers. "What's making you so nervous?" he asked them. "We're only hunting." But wasn't this very cliff such a memorable place? The crown prince shouted out and told him he couldn't expect to seek revenge here and get away with it. Oh, but he wouldn't be doing anything. Black smoke swirled around him, gathering to form a mass. This unfortunate accident would be caused by a fierce beast that had attacked them while out hunting. The beast killed their personal knight and the princes died tragically while falling off the cliff. He explained what was going to happen here. An enormous beast emerged from the black smoke and stood next to Magnus. It snarled as the crown prince shouted out arrogantly. Magnus smiled wickedly and told him that he shouldn't shout around a wild beast. It would only irritate it. It lunged forward, paws pounding on the ground as it ran towards the princes. He gazed down, from the top of the cliff. They jumped, but it was a useless attempt at escape. The beast had gotten them regardless of their actions. He smiled, satisfied with this outcome. He'd finally gotten the revenge he so longed for. The beast spoke to him. Was this enough? No, he answered. This was just a stepping stone to his Lina. There was much more to do before he finally got her. The beast was amused. It would be by his side as Magnus continued on in his reign of despair and anger. Ileana was startled awake as Shulia shouted out. She'd been sleeping amongst piles of books. She'd come to the library just as she finished her exams. She was restless because soon it would be time for her to return. After the water incident, Simeon's bullying persisted and Shulia's interference had helped, but she'd focused on looking for more information about the Book of Prophecy. She'd run into a dead end on that regard. She was curious about what had captured Shulia's interest as she read a newsletter. Ileana was startled at what she saw. The emperor had passed away. The two princes were also no more as their bodies were discovered weeks earlier near a cliff. But rest assured, Shulia told Ileana. Just before his passing, the emperor had named the third son who returned a year ago, as the new successor to the throne. Magnus had killed his brothers. Ileana felt ill with all that she'd heard, and it showed on her face. Shulia suggested she go back to the dorms for some much-needed rest. With as much time that's passed, it wasn't enough to erase their painful past. But it should have been enough time to forget each other. She still felt anxious after all this time. Shulia interrupted her thoughts before she left. The coronation of the new emperor would take place in the capital. If Ileana hurried, she might be able to attend. But Ileana just took her words with a smile. She'd never go to him. All she could do was watch him from afar. Back at the capital, nobles looked on as the crown was placed on Magnus' head as he kneeled. They all whispered, words like daggers about how unfit he was for the throne. Wasn't he under suspicion for the deaths of the princes? But they could not speak up any louder, too scared of the new emperor. Shouts of praise rang through the hall and all throughout the empire. The crowds chanted, happiness everywhere. A new reign had begun under His Majesty, Emperor Magnus Declude. Ileana sat in the hall as a priest stood at the front, giving a closing speech and congratulating everyone for completing the 2-year priest training. Now it was time for Ileana to return to the capital. For both Magnus and Ileana, this was the start of a new chapter. Ileana found it strange how the Glain estate was prepared for her arrival. She'd returned abruptly, yet they'd been there, waiting to greet her. As she entered, the butler told her the Marquis waited for her and her steps faltered at his words. Her father was staying in this mansion. He wished to dine with her and to discuss her last 2 years as a devotee. She agreed and walked up the steps to her room. She'd been curious about his lack of reaction to his daughter leaving home for 2 years, but it seemed he knew all along where she'd been. She lay in the bath as rose petals stuck to her now unblemished skin, which were once covered in bruises. Marquis Glain was a character that was mentioned only once in the novel. When Magnus had come to slaughter the Glain family, he found the Marquis covered in the blood of his own wife. He'd taken her life and wore her blood like a badge as he'd waited for the emperor. It seemed she had yet another obstacle in her life. Now she needed to find out more about Magnus while fooling the Marquis. If Magnus, who was now the emperor, hadn't given up his search for Ileana, what she needed to do was stay out of sight, and to do that, she needed to avoid the social world. As the maids helped her dress, she prepared herself to meet her father. She entered to find him already at the table. He called her name softly, and fear almost froze her to the ground. She forced herself to smile and sat. "Did you enjoy your 2 years of freedom?" he asked her. Practicing to become a devotee and freeing her little Pat. How amusing he found it all. Shock kept her from responding. He knew about Magnus. He watched her with cold eyes. "You've forgotten your manners while you've been away," he said when she didn't respond fast enough. She stuttered out an answer, but he interrupted her as he told her that while he'd not bothered her, that was his mercy for holding her leash tightly for so long. But it seemed like he shouldn't have allowed her so much freedom if this was the result. It seemed she needed disciplining once more. She sat quiet, as terror overwhelmed her. She remembered the bruises on her body and fear wrapped around her neck like a noose choking her. Was the original Ileana a victim of domestic abuse? She still hadn't responded, and the Marquis grew annoyed. "From today you are not permitted to leave the estate without permission," he said as he got up and walked to the door. She jumped up and shouted out, "Father." He couldn't ban her from leaving. She needed to change his mind. She panicked, but then an idea struck her. She told him she couldn't remember anything. At the temple she'd come down with a severe fever after one of the trainees bullied her and threw cold water on her. And she'd lost her memories as a result. Her childhood memories were foggy, and even her father seemed unfamiliar to her. She couldn't believe she'd become one of those people who'd use the cliché amnesia as an excuse. To make it believable, Ileana forced tears out hoping it would be all the more convincing, but his expression remained the same. As if his face were made of stone and couldn't make any other expression other than the cold, unreadable one he had on. He headed for the door. The butler was to call a physician tomorrow and to give her a checkup. And to report to him the result. As he left, he told her to head up and rest because she was still not allowed to leave the estate. Starting tomorrow, she would relearn everything she'd been taught before. For every dinner, he would question her on her learnings. And for every wrong answer, there would be punishment. She fell into the chair, exhausted. Had she managed to fool him? His expression remained inscrutable, so she was unsure. After that encounter, she felt ill and no longer had an appetite. She sighed. She'd done good enough for today. It would be all right, she assured herself. The Marquis sat in his office. The butler knew what to do. He was to find the one who dared to douse their lady in water. He was to carefully observe Ileana as well. She was indeed different, so she must have really lost her memories, but her entire behavior seemed much too different to only have suffered from amnesia. He opened a letter as the butler left. It was a letter from Magnus. The young emperor is quite bold with his words, he said as he watched the letter catch light and burn. He'd been sending countless letters to the Glane estate. She regretted it, she thought as she sat at a desk, reading yet another thick book. She should have just eaten that dinner if she knew this would happen. He'd banned her from eating anything because she couldn't answer one question. How ridiculous was this situation? Every day she's given 2 thick books. She's to memorize those books and would be questioned every evening by the Marquis. If she can't answer a question, she is not allowed even a sip of water. A knock on the door announced it was time for dinner, or as she'd like to think of it, quiz time. She needed to do well this time or else she might very well starve to death. She sat, hands folded in her lap as he ate and questioned her. She answered his question and named the departments in the imperial palace. There were 4 official departments and 2 special institutions. The Ministry of Finance, the Imperial Family, the Inner Palace, and the Treasurer. The 2 special institutions were the Medical Division, which held imperial doctors, and the Order of Chivalry, which was the imperial knights known as Storm. But there was one more institution which was created to keep corruption within the aristocracy in check. This was public officials. He smiled and complimented her, then motioned for her to eat. She was alarmed. She never knew he could show any other expression on his usually stoic face, let alone smile. Was she that shocked at being starved? He questioned her and she told him there were usually better ways to enforce discipline, like positive reinforcement. But he just waved her off. It was better than his usual punishment, he said. Of course, being starved over being beaten would be better for anyone in such a situation, she thought bitterly. This was the last of her lesson, he said as he got ready to leave. Tomorrow had something else planned, so she was to be ready. He informed her that the new emperor who'd taken the throne after he went on a purge had left many unoccupied titles. A woman commoner had also taken the title Mendez, the Marquis commented disdainfully. Mendez was the head of the medical division. The emperor's behavior had created quite a large rift between the imperial family and the aristocracy. He could be trying to mend this in an unusual way, because 2 days ago he'd mentioned taking an empress, and there would be a banquet held for this. Of course, Ileana had received an invitation as well. His words sent shivers down her spine, and she got up abruptly, knocking a glass of wine over. It shattered, startling her. Her father watched her in silence. The maid insisted she'd clean up the mess and Ileana sat down, composed once again. He did not wish for her to be empress, he told her. He'd noticed her anxiety. His words surprised her. She was his only heir, therefore there was no need to stand out for the emperor. All she needed to do was enjoy herself. She'd heard his words, but worry plagued her. There wasn't a lot of information in the novel about the banquet, but there was a single line that stood out amongst everything else. During the banquet, the emperor would encounter Ileana Glane. She laid on the bed and sighed. It was the morning of the day she'd been dreading. Tonight, the banquet would be held at the palace. She washed her face and thought about the novel. Magnus would find Ileana at this banquet and she needed to prevent that as much as she could. She had time to spare before leaving for the palace tonight, and a maid suggested having tea in the garden would help pass time. She sat outside in an open pavilion. Although she'd been restless, now she was absolutely bored. It was quiet and peaceful. Almost like the calm before the storm, she thought amusingly. A voice interrupted her thoughts and she looked to see the Marquis approaching her. He found it unusual for her to be out here. He joined her at the table, and she greeted him sweetly as she said, "Good morning, father." Her innocent greeting visibly startled him, and he awkwardly gave a greeting in return. She, of course, noticed this and it confused her. Why was he so uncomfortable? He told her that her residence for the banquet had been decided. He asked her if she remembered the rules for the imperial banquet. All attendees of the banquet were not allowed to leave the imperial grounds without His Majesty's permission. They were to stay in the palace for the week. The residence that had been bestowed on them was the Moon Spring Palace. A palace fit for a marquis. This surprised Ileana because she knew that the residences were given according to a family's standing. He told her that the Glane family had contributed much to the founding of this empire, so it was only right she'd receive such a palace. She realized that when Magnus had destroyed the Glane family, he not only wiped out a noble family but a founding family of the empire. She was amazed at how crazy Magnus truly was. But then again, the author had described his mind as tainted with anger and resentment towards her. The Marquis was curious about the extent of her memory loss. As she sipped her tea, she told him that she definitely remembered her father and that this was her home. Silence hung in the air, and it grew all the more tense as they both kept quiet after her ambiguous statement. Was that really all she remembered? He abruptly got up and cleared his throat as he announced it was time to go. But where was he going? He would be visiting the palace for some work. "Take care," she said with a serene smile which unsettled him. He glanced at her as he left, his stoic mask set in place. She kept her smile in place until he was out of sight and then revealed her true emotions, annoyance. She'd been so polite, and he didn't even crack a smile? What was wrong with him? She arrived at the palace and looked up at the large building. She stood in her signature color, a red dress. Now she was Ileana and not Lina, and he was Magnus and not Mag. She made her way to the stairs. She'd hoped they wouldn't run into each other, even if by chance. She took a deep breath to calm her nerves, but she couldn't seem to stop her racing heart. She'd intentionally arrived an hour early so they wouldn't run into each other immediately. Aside from that, would she be able to do well amongst all those nobles? The herald asked her if she'd like to enter. She'd been standing at the entrance doors for quite a while now. She closed her eyes and clasped her hands together. She straightened her back. She needed to appear confident if she were to make it through the night with nobles all around her. For now, she wasn't the person who read the novel. She was now Ileana Glane. They announced her entry and all nobles took notice as she stepped forward. As she walked forward, she heard whispers all around her. About her training as a priest, about what a crazy devotee and believer of God she was. She kept walking, making her way forward, unfazed as one lady spoke about the stench she brought with her. The stench of the lower class. She leaned against the wall and drank a flute of champagne. She'd heard all their insults because they'd wanted her to hear, as they spoke loudly. No one looked at her, but she could still feel their unpleasant eyes on her, attention trained on her. But it didn't matter because what really made her curious was the unusual number of ladies with hair colors ranging close to white. Was this the new trend? She smirked. This was good because now she really wouldn't stand out. An announcement rang throughout the room. His Majesty, Magnus de Clued is entering. It startled Ileana. He stepped forward and everyone bowed as he made his way to the front of the room. She seamlessly blended into the crowd. It's fine, she wouldn't be spotted. He wouldn't recognize her because she'd always worn a mask when she met him, and her hair allowed her to be one of the many white-headed ladies here. He sat and ordered everyone to rise. Blood rushed through her body as she looked at him. She could hear her heartbeat, it was so loud. The mag that would always smile at her and hang on to her every word didn't exist anymore. That person sitting there was the one and only Emperor, Magnus. Another announcement. Head of the medical division, Cheryl Cynthia, is entering. She flinched as she watched the female lead walk up to Magnus, and he smiled as he welcomed her. What was this feeling? It welled up inside of her. A voice so malicious. Don't smile at her, it screamed out. The pain in her chest as that possessive voice called out to Magnus. He was hers. It was the original Ileana's voice, she realized, and it overwhelmed her. She knew their eyes would eventually meet. She couldn't deny it. This tingling sensation in her body, the voice that kept screaming Magnus, was hers. She tried to control it, but she couldn't. This jealousy. He announced the beginning of the banquet as Cheryl stood beside him. Was that her? Cheryl questioned Magnus, but he answered vaguely, who knows? But she'd caught him staring at the lady. Why was Magnus ignoring her when he said he'd make her his right away? He'd been waiting for this moment, working so hard to find her. To think she would appear in front of him like this, he said. But he wasn't ignoring her, no. From the crowd, Ileana watched them. As Cheryl let out a laugh, she swiftly turned and left as fast as she could. She couldn't contain this overwhelming feeling telling her to rip them apart. She'd needed to leave before she did something disgraceful. But how did he find her amongst this ridiculous crowd? Cheryl wanted to know. Since a rumor came out that he liked silver hair, noble ladies dyed their hair white to attract his attention. And she'd worn a mask so he wouldn't be able to recognize her eyes. The lady might just resemble the person he'd been looking for. How could he not recognize her, he told Cheryl. She was certainly the person he'd been looking for, he said, possession oozed from his eyes. Cheryl grew uneasy at his expression and left him to have a drink which Magnus teased her about. She left and approached the waiter, excitement in her eyes as she spotted alcohol. Nobles approached her as they bombarded her with insincere compliments, she knew. Was she close with His Majesty? How did she capture his heart? They heard she'd worked in a village as a medic. What kind of medicine and methods did she use? She felt suffocated with each question asked, and she enthusiastically said, "You just need to practice medicine very skillfully." They all seemed confused, and she used that brief silence to make her escape. She made her way to the balcony. She hated such uncomfortable situations. As she stepped out onto the terrace, she noticed a lady there. As she turned, white hair shimmering in the moonlight, Cheryl instantly knew who she was.